Hi everyone, in this tutorial we will learn how to set up the fire geometry nodes, which is a little more advanced to set up in comparison to the others, and learn about some of its main parameters and many tips as well. And at the end of the video we will show a little walkthrough of this first piece scene that we did for our presentation using this effect. The first thing you need to know is that this geometry node effect will create a 3D fire, smoke, and hot air effect that is independent to the smart weathering shader, but it can be connected to it. In fact, this was the effect that pushed us to create smart weathering geometry node setups that could potentially be connected to the main shader effects. Now, in order to use it, we will need to prepare our ingredients as any cooking recipe. Instead of only having a single collection, we will need two. One for the meters, which will contain the object that will be spawning the fire, and the other for what we call igniters. These igniters are just simple 3D objects that intersect with the emitters, and when the igniter is animated, will let us create the illusion that the fire is burning the object. Now, aside from having two collections, it is also recommended to have a low poly version of the setup. The low poly version should be the one used for the geometry nodes, and the high poly version would be the one that is displayed. It is of course not mandatory, but it is highly advisable because it will help to boost performance a lot. A workflow tip is to add a transparent material to the igniters, so that when you are working creating these effects, you will not see them in the render view. But this is not that important because the igniters collection can be turned off completely when doing the render, so they will not be displayed. And another good tip is that if you're going to use a low poly version, make sure to parent that low poly version to the high poly one, so when you display the high poly one and interact with it, the low poly one will adjust accordingly. This way, when you're working with the effect, you will have to enable only the high poly version, and when you're ready to render, you can turn off all the igniters and keep on only the high poly emitter and the fire geometry node effect. So now that we have our scene prepared, we can add our geometry node effect object and follow the same principle as the other effects, which is not adding this object in the same collection that we will be used as the base collection. In this case, it shouldn't be either in the emitters or the igniters collection. Now, if we do an overview of this effect, we can see that its parameters are divided in different sections, like basic, previewing, advanced, interaction, and also shader. And if we go to the material tab, we can see that it has assigned our custom materials to create the effect, that you can also tweak by changing the sliders. Now, in order to make the fire appear, we will need to use the collections that we set before. In this case, I added only the meters one, and you can see that the fire effect is created from the whole object. That is why we need to add our igniters collection. By doing so, now the fire effect is spawned only in the intersection of these emitters and igniters objects. You can see that by adjusting the basic parameters, I get a starting point of this fire effect. Now, before diving into its parameters, it is worth to highlight that this fire effect is composed with other sub-effects. These are the main flame, the smoke, hot air, and a simple flame. The main flame, smoke, and hot air effects uses a particle simulation method. The simple flame, on the other hand, uses a different method. This simple flame sub-element is meant to create more subtle and controlled flames. That could be a good option when you want to create a fire effect on small objects like a candle or a paper, for example. In this case, I'm showing how this simple flame would look in this barrel, and that it can be complemented with the main flame one. Now that we understand the different components of the fire effect, we can start playing with the main ones that are based on the particle system. To have a better preview, we recommend using the Show Particle option in the previewing section. This will let you choose some simpler to compute particles to preview the effect, which will help a lot in performance and will be very helpful to better visualize how the effect changes as you play with the parameters. Now let's see some of the main parameters. The first one is the igniter tolerance. You can see that when we increase this value, the tolerance on the intersection is increased and more particles are created. The next one is an option to enable using the volume intersection to create the particles, but it is not that recommended because it will be heavier to compute. In case that you have multiple igniters in the same collection, you can use the option to use a mesh boolean to calculate the intersection. However, it is advised that the igniter should be a single mesh and should be as simple as possible. Now, the particles emitted will change the amount of particles used to create the effect. If you are going to create a turbulent or a very detailed fire, it's advised to increase this value. If you are going to need a big fire in your scene, you will need to probably increase the duration of the effect. This will also be helpful if you want to give the smoke some room. You can increase the duration and lower the flame extension in the material section. If you now want to increase the quality of the fire effect, you will have to play with the detail parameters. This, of course, will increase the computing power needed to create the effect. So it is advised to keep it low when you are previewing the effect and increase it when you are ready to render. Also, a good tip when rendering is to use motion blur. This will increase the realism when rendering, and especially with animations. Another thing to keep in mind that you will probably notice of the fire effect when you are in render mode is that you will notice some black shapes around the fire effect. This is because it is created with a transparent shader, and when many faces overlap, besides the fire effect is optimized to avoid this from happening, you can easily fix this by increasing the transparent samples. And another thing you may notice in this setup is that you will see kind of a halo around the flame. That is the hot air sub-element, and you can see that when I change the background to a normal HDRI, it will not be visible. This is because the hot air uses a transmission shader, so you can opt to disable this sub-element or lower the amount of hot air in the material section. Now, if we now move to the advanced section, we can see parameters like up force, which will make the particles go faster upwards, turbulence particles, which will add a turbulence force to the particles created, and turbulence mesh, that will add some turbulence to the mesh created from the particles. This is a more subtle effect though. The main flame points remover will let you control at which age the particles start being seen. This value is expressed in frames, and it is basically added to give some room to the simple flame effect. The last parameter of the advanced section is the initial force. This option will let you create a wind effect if you enable it. You will need to pick a from object and a to object. The vector that is created from the position of these two objects will determine the initial force direction and magnitude. So keep in mind that the farther away they are, the stronger the force will be. Now, the fire effect by default will create particles that will act as we can see in the video. Under the interaction section, you will have options to make this effect interact with its surrounding objects. So you can add a third collection where you put the objects that will be surrounding the fire, and the moment you add it, you will see that these particles will start interacting with it. And you will also have the option to enable self-collision. This will make the particles collide with the emitter objects. Lastly, when you are done creating your effect using these parameters, remember that you can tweak the look of them in the material section. In this case, I will adjust the flame effect and the smoke by changing the spread and density, for example. Now, as we finished explaining how the fire geometry nodes work, we can now explain how to connect it to the smart weathering shader effect. And to do so, there are two ways. The first one is by using the helper that we provide. This helper is inside the node group section, and you will need to just drag and drop it into the object and assign the fire igniter, that in this case I will use the high poly version. This barrel already has a smart weathering node in its materials, with the fire and heat simply turned on. So you can see that the moment I added it, the effect appeared, and when I moved the igniter, the effect adjusted accordingly. We can see now that you can turn on and off the fire and heat effect at any time whenever you wish to. You will need to just remember that all these effects must be added on all the materials the object has. Now there is a second method to set this up. To do so, you will not need this helper, so you can remove it from your object. Then you will need to hide your original collection from the viewport and render as well. And then in the fire object, you'll have to choose show emitters and as duplicates. This option is only possible when you are using the high poly version of the emitters. When you check that box, a duplicate of the original collection will be shown, and if the object had the fire and heat effects enabled on it, it will be shown accordingly. Now, to sum up and to see a practical sample of all the concepts that we have been talking about, here is a scene of this barrel being knocked down, and you can see that the fire effect will adapt to this animation as well. Here you can see that using a low poly version, we can get a high performance preview of the effect. And once I get the effect I want, I will add this helper and use a smart weathering shader node with the fire effect on. I will change the mode to burn instead of metal. I will enable the heat. I will add the fire influence, play a bit with the warm influence as well. I will add some bubbles in the warm effect, disable the top corrosion and top influence, and enable and play a little bit with the cracks to get the look that I want. I will just adjust a little bit the stage of the heat and add some more amount to the fire effect. And once I'm happy with that, I will copy the effect to the other material. I will just slightly adjust it, the distance value mainly, and the stage, because I don't want it to look so heated. And once I'm done with that, I can preview how this animation would look with this effect on. And now I can enable the geometry node effect over it. You can now see how all these effects work together to create this fire effect, and you will get a clearer picture if I turn on and off the fire geometry nodes and show or hide the smart weathering shader effect. And if you're one of those that you're still watching this video until this mark, well, first of all, congratulations. And because of your effort, here is a bonus example that we mentioned at the beginning of the video. This scene is one that we used for our presentation video, the first piece. And in this case, we are seeing some of the background elements, which are a few trunks that will have a fire effect on it. And to create it, we did all what we have been explaining throughout the video. And you can see that basically a simple animated mesh acts as an igniter. And we added our helper into the trunks. Then we added a smart weathering over the shader that the trunks had. We started playing with the parameters until we got the look that we wanted. And here you can see that once you get the look, if you move the igniter, the effect will adapt. And we are also showing that you can activate the vanish option in the fire effect to make the mesh kind of look that it disappears. Once we get the shader look, we activate the fire geometry nodes. We turn off the light that we needed to see the effect, and we added a helper light to boost the fire effect realism. For the force speed, here is what it looks from behind of the camera. We can see that it is an animated object, has basically a principled shader to create the metal look, and we will add on top of it our smart weathering shader node, activate the heat in this case, it is not necessarily the fire one, and play with the worn influence, the stage values, and the different parameters inside the worn as well to get the look that we wanted. And after we're done with that, we created a small flame to create the final effect. Well, that would be it. We really hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial and you find it useful. If you do so, you will help us a lot if you give a like, subscribe, spread the word, and all those things. See you in the next video. Saludos.